So, Andrei, do you want to weigh in on the topic of World War II in any way?
Yes, I do. First of all, I would have to say that there is a disconnect between correlation of a formal political system and its supposedly humanitarian, attitudes. I mean, some of the very worst crimes and largest crimes committed in modern human history have been committed by the nominally democratic states. So it doesn't really matter all that much. Uh, I will want to shed some light on one of the events which didn't happen but almost happened, and this is the intervention of the Franco-British troops in Finland, or better to say in Scandinavia, because Finland was just a pretext, not an end goal in itself. And this is something which was supposedly to take part in March or April of 1940. So they took some time. The initial proposition for this kind of intervention from the French and British actually came at the beginning, I think, beginning of February. So this was after this initial phase of the Red Army, which was more or less unsuccessful, which emboldened them. The context is important here. Now, at this time, there was this so-called phony war happening on the Western Front, which meant that there wasn't really actual combat being done between the Franco-British troops and the Germans. They were in a state of war, but everybody was sitting on its own side of the border, and there wasn't really any movement or serious combat. There were some small skirmishes between patrols and things like that, but nothing important. Which meant that there was considerable amount of strategic reserves from the Franco-British side, which could be deployed at some other fronts. And there was this total hysteria. I think that only the beginning of special military operation in 2022 is comparable to hysteria which was being pumped up especially by the British, also to the extent French and the American media at the time. Soviet Union was also kicked out of the League of Nations at the first things of the order. So these things are very familiar, with current affairs. But what they did, they once they were sort of certain that it wouldn't be like a parade walk for the Red Army, that it's supposedly stuck in a Karelia, they conjured up this idea to sort of help out the Finland by sending them troops. Now, obviously, being in a state of war with Germany, they couldn't do it through Baltic Sea, and they declined to do it from the port of Petsamo, far north, because it was too dangerous to do so. But more importantly, that they had the other idea in mind. The actual idea wasn't really to help Finland at all. The idea was actually to bring in Norway and Sweden to war with Germany, to provoke Germans to invade Norway and Sweden. Because the initial proposition was for 100,000 British troops and 35,000, I think, or so French troops were supposed to be sent to this expedition. And because both Norwegian and Swedish government, for obvious reasons, declined the request to allow their military presence, because Germans stated, and everybody knew it was in the public, that in case of the Franco-British troops coming into Scandinavia, Germans will militarily interfere. Now, why is it important? Because at the time, the Swedish mines, metallic ore mines, were about half of the entire steel production. They were being provided by them, German steel production, as I said. And the most quality steel was coming from Sweden, not from Germany itself. Germany had their own ore deposits, but these were of lesser quality, not for high tech gear like large caliber guns and things like that. For this, Swedish steel was used, and Sweden was, on one hand, it was satisfied to continue doing the business deals with the Third Reich. On the other hand, they were also being intimidated by the Germans, so there's a little bit of both in question. But they knew that in case of the British troops being present on their territory, they would be invaded by the Germans. And something like this happened a little bit later with the Norwegians. So this sort of dragged on this military planning. And from the available documents, it is known that actually only smaller part of these troops were supposed to actually reach Finland itself. Only token force, totally out of proportion to actual fighting the Red Army. Most of these troops would be deployed in Norway and in Sweden, expecting Germans to come forward to invade. But nevertheless, from the British perspective, it would still be good enough because they would disrupt the supply of ores to Germany. Never mind that both Norway and Sweden will be completely devastated by the war, which had nothing to do with their national interests. So this is kind of a repeating pattern of the British foreign policy, dragging various different countries to their own war against their better interests. Same thing happened in 1940 with Greece, and they almost initially invaded Norway in 1940 because. Now, this is something which even in Norway people know about this, but they don't really like to talk about it because it's politically inconvenient. British devised this plan called Air 4 for invasion of Norway, precisely to cut this transportation of ores coming to Germany. And they already laid some naval minefields in Norwegian territorial waters to disrupt this transport within territorial waters of a neutral country, which prompted Germans to actually go. They only invaded Norway, they didn't go for Sweden, because only British troops were present in Norway at the time. But essentially, British dragged Norwegians into war against their interests and against their wishes. Now, of course, once they were invaded initially by the Germans, they had to join the Allied side, got conquered, and essentially the Germans wiped the floor with this expeditionary corps jointly of the French and the British, completely kicked them out, and they barely managed to evacuate and to safety of the British Isles, only due to superiority of British fleet. But it was heavily. They were being deported from Narvik, and they lost a lot of prisoners. Nevertheless, they lost a lot of ships. It was completely debacle. So it's completely ludicrous to imagine how they were expecting that this entire endeavor would be sustained in case of things actually going the way they were planning to do. And it's obviously very similar to the current situation when, again, British and the French are going with this, completely ludicrous ideas of sending troops to Ukraine, completely inadequate in both numbers and equipment and sustainment. But nevertheless, there is this precedent in which they are just itching for the fight against vastly superior opponent without any like a rhyme of reason. They couldn't do it in 1940, and they couldn't do it today, but it doesn't stop them. So there is this kind of a deep irrationality in the British mode of thinking about just wanting to stick it up to the Russians, no matter what.
So you're taking it beyond ideology, and you're claiming that it's just irrational. It's not even ideologically explained to keep engaging in these adventures, so to speak.
Yes. I mean, back in 1919, Alexander knows this. French were already in Odessa for about, I think, 2 months or so, and they were kicked out by the locals, not even by the Red Army, but by the local uprising. So it didn't end well for them then, and it's very hard to imagine how it would end for them again if they would, engage in it, especially not comforted by the locals, but by the proper nuclear armed army. But yeah, there is this kind of this is more of the British than the French thing. This kind of impossible schemes that they're just being thrown around. Sometimes they work, sometimes they nearly work, like Churchill's plan of the Dardanelles operation in the First World War, which was nearly a success, and it wasn't as bad as failure as political and later historiography claims to be, but it was failure nevertheless. But more often than not, they're simply just they're coming from a position of the weaker side in geopolitical struggle, and there is constant pressure for them to kind of equalize this by these asymmetrical approaches, mostly by sacrificing other people's lives to suit their needs. I mean, when you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, they did the very same thing with the Portuguese and the Spanish. And of course, the famous British gold, which was pouring all across Europe, funding other peoples to fight against Napoleon. So there is this long line of the precedents coming from centuries in continental interventions from the British side.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the French go in Odessa in 1919, I think they're pretty fed up with World War I. And so by then, from what I've read, they were ready to mutiny. So it was like they didn't want to be there either. So the fact that the locals did not want them, I think, is just the icing on the cake.